Here, read this.
Woof.
This is the front of John Kay's bookshop here in Edinburgh, and this is, of course, William Shakespeare. Now, you might be wondering, why is there a plaque depicting William Shakespeare on a bookshop in Edinburgh? Just round the corner from here, on Victoria Street, we have the Royal Mile, and if you walk down the Royal Mile, on the right, you'll come to Blackfriars Street. This is the street where King James commissioned the erection of a temporary theatre at which English comedians performed. We actually took a little trip there recently on an episode of the podcast where I was interviewing Donald Smith, and we talked a little bit about the Shakespeare connection.
A prime example of that is the visits of Shakespeare's company to perform here in this street in Blackfriars Wynd in Edinburgh in the 1500s. Now, how the hell could this happen? Well, because theatre was banned apart from anything else. But of course, James VI, later to become first of England, Ireland, etc., was mad keen on theatre. And he married Anne of Denmark, who was equally mad keen on theatre. So Shakespeare's company, we don't think Shakespeare, there's no evidence that Shakespeare himself travelled 3 different times. They toured to Edinburgh, and James organised a temporary theatre for them here in Blackfriars Street, defying the town council's ban on theatre.
Since then, I have read this book called Murder Under Trust by Arthur Melville Clarke. Now, you heard Donald there saying that he didn't think Shakespeare himself ever actually visited Edinburgh, or that there's no evidence for it. Arthur Melville Clarke does not agree. So today I thought I'd just tell you Clarke's theory of how Shakespeare came to Edinburgh. This book came out in 1981. It's subtitled The Topical Macbeth, arguing that the play Macbeth is full of topical allusions to Scotland, particularly to King James, we'll come to that, but also that it is a play that is essentially a study of the Scottish national character, contains lots of topical allusions to Scottish politics, Scottish law in particular, and presents a very up-to-date, immediate and detailed picture of Scottish topography and language. He's really up against it. I mean, the common view is that there isn't much topical in Shakespeare. I have to say I disagreed a lot with a lot of this book, particularly in its claims to accurately and intimately describe Scotland. However, when it comes to royal matters, I think that Clarke is on the strongest ground. The kind of centrepiece of his argument is a chapter detailing the correspondences between the plot of Macbeth and the Gowrie conspiracy, an attempt to kill King James in the year 1600. Clarke argues that there is much more of the Gowrie conspiracy than, say, the gunpowder plot in Macbeth. And he puts together a pretty compelling argument. There are a lot of commonalities from the very start, the invitation of a supposed friend to his castle in Perth. This is the Earl of Gowrie, just as Macbeth invites Duncan and kills him under trust, hence the title of this book. Clarke mines a whole system of references to the events of the day in which the Earl of Gowrie tried to have King James assassinated. And if you're interested, I advise you seek this book out on the strength of that chapter alone. Something else that Clarke gets round to is putting forward a theory of how Shakespeare came to Scotland. And this is done as a way of explaining why he argues Macbeth is full of so many topical allusions. So the story, according to Clarke, begins in 1599, when King James VI of Scotland, as he was then, we're still a few years off him taking the English crown as well, grants a royal warrant to a group of English comedians to perform within the city of Edinburgh. And this involves a payment of £40 for timber and other materials to build their theatre on Blackfriars Wynd, now Blackfriars Street. So that's where that part of the story comes from, as discussed in the podcast interview with Donald. And it should be said that James's patronage of these English comedians was very much against the wishes of the Kirk, that looked upon any kind of theatrical performance as a threat to morality. But after a few performances, possibly at Holyrood Palace, they are given this warrant and they have their theatre on Blackfriars Street. And incidentally, Clarke mentions the coincidence of there being 2 theatres associated with Shakespeare that were both built on land belonging to the Dominicans, Blackfriars Street here in Edinburgh, and then the much longer lasting and better known Blackfriars Theatre in London. What Clarke also mentions is that one of these English actors, Lawrence Fletcher, was a favourite of King James, and whilst Fletcher was performing around Scotland, he was known as His Majesty's comedian. So, 4 years later, Elizabeth I finally dies, and James becomes King of England as well as Scotland. Less than a month after he arrives in London, he transforms the Chamberlain's men, as it was then, to the King's men, in a royal patent listing Lawrence Fletcher as the first member of the company and William Shakespeare as the second, indicating, for scholars like Clarke, that James might have been familiar not only with Lawrence Fletcher, but the whole of the Chamberlain's men, and that Shakespeare and co. might have been the English comedians that he had favoured in Edinburgh. And finally, Clarke goes one step further, and having argued for an earlier composition date for Macbeth than is generally agreed upon, suggests that one of the plays those English comedians performed was indeed Macbeth, written in the immediate aftermath of the Gowrie conspiracy as a way of celebrating the king's survival. So there you have it. That is Arthur Melville's Clarke theory of how Shakespeare could have spent time in Edinburgh, and that is broadly the patter that I am now going to memorise for when anyone asks why we've got Shakespeare on our door.